Welcome to Sengoku Daimyo's Chronicles of Japan. My name's Joshua, and this is episode 84, The Middle Way Through the Middle Kingdom. First things first, thank you to Bodil, Gabe, and Lauren for donating to support the show on Ko-fi and Patreon. If you'd like to join them, I will have information at the end of the episode. Also, an apology. If my voice isn't in tip-top shape, well, it seems that COVID finally found us after 3 years or so, and I'm on the tail end of it. So, thank you for your understanding. Now, last episode, we talked about Siddhartha Gautama, aka Shakyamuni, the historical Buddha, and his teachings and how they spread, at least through the Indian subcontinent, with patronage of rulers like Ashoka the Great. The original teachings, initially taught as an oral tradition, were eventually turned into a series of writings called the Tripitaka. As for how those writings came about, it's worth talking a little bit about the languages involved. Now, the native language of Shakyamuni was probably a language known as Magadhi or Magadan, something like that. But the Indian subcontinent, including the modern countries of India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Bhutan, Nepal, and Afghanistan, is over 3 times the size of Western Europe. There are 8 South Asian language families, with hundreds of different languages depending on how you count them. The modern state of India counts 22 official languages, not including English. I mention this to point out that as the Buddha's disciples spread his teachings, they were by necessity translating it into different languages. There's a story that a student suggested to the Buddha that they make Sanskrit the official language of Buddhism. Even then, Sanskrit was considered a language of learning and education, much as Greek or Latin was in medieval Europe. But the Buddha rejected this and insisted that his teachings be taught in people's own tongue. This proved great for reaching people, but over time there was a fear that the oral teachings might be lost, and so they were eventually written down. The oldest written Buddhist canon is generally agreed to be texts in Pali, commissioned in Sri Lanka. These are sometimes called the Southern Tripitaka, or Tipitaka in Pali, and it's the primary canon for Theravada Buddhists. In the north, however, Sanskrit remained the prominent language of learning, and texts written down and transmitted in the north, particularly those that made it to China and to Japan, were often Sanskrit or translations of Sanskrit texts. This is what some refer to as the Northern Tripitaka. Both of these were transcriptions of the oral teachings that the Buddhist monks were otherwise memorizing and presenting to the Buddhist community. That oral tradition, in fact, never really went away, and these early texts were more like a reference so that monks could check their memory. Chanting the sutras, and especially chanting from memory, remained a highly prized skill of Buddhist orators. Now, the split between northern and southern texts is convenient, but it isn't necessarily as simple as all that. We have plenty of examples of texts, particularly in the northern traditions, that don't necessarily have an extant Sanskrit counterpart. In fact, the oldest extant sutras of any tradition that we have today are known as the Gandharan Sutras, and they're written in the Gandhari language using a Kharoshthi script. Gandhara, by the way, refers to a region centered north and west of the Indus River in modern Pakistan, stretching to the Kabul River Valley in modern Afghanistan, and north to the Karakoram Mountains, which is one of the interlocking ranges that form the boundary between modern Pakistan and India and modern China and the Tibetan Plateau. Gandhara is believed to be the namesake of the city of Kandahar in modern Afghanistan. This area was important not just to Buddhism. For thousands of years, it has been a crossroads between the Indian subcontinent, the area known as the Middle East, and the inner trade routes of Central Eurasia. It was part of the conquest by Alexander the Great in the 4th century BCE, becoming part of his kingdom, but then it was lost in battle to the Mauryan Empire, which Ashoka the Great ruled in the 3rd century BCE. The area later fell to Indo-Greek rule from members of the Greco-Bactrian kingdom to the north, and the most famous ruler during that period was probably Menander I, who is also remembered as a patron of Buddhism, building more stupas and monasteries in the region. The Hellenic Greco-Bactrians were eventually displaced by tribes of Baekje, who themselves were being displaced by the Xiongnu in Central Eurasia. In this epic game of musical chairs, a branch of the Yuezhi eventually settled in the area, ruling a large territory, including Gandhara, under what is now known as the Kushan Empire. They had first moved into the area of Bactria and Sogdiana probably around the 1st or 2nd century BCE, and by the 1st century CE, they were exerting authority over Gandhara. Around the time the Gandharan sutras were written down in the 1st or 2nd centuries, Buddhism, especially Mahayana Buddhism, was flourishing in that region. And Kanishka the Great, and don't you love how all these rulers are known as the Great, by the way? Well, he ruled the Kushan Empire and hence Gandhara in the early 2nd century. He's said to have been a great patron of Buddhism, although it was one of several religions, including Zoroastrianism, that flourished in the region at this time. By the way, these Yuezhi, it's believed that they are the same people that we mentioned in episode 79 when we talked about the Han diplomat Zhang Qian, who had trekked through hostile Xiongnu or Hunna territory across much of what is now western China in the 2nd century BCE, seeking allies against the Hunna. At that point, the Yuezhi had pretty much had enough of war, and they declined to fight, preferring to settle where they were and eventually growing into what we now know as the Kushan Empire. That connection with the Han dynasty, however, likely was maintained through trade routes that continued to operate across the vast expanse of Central Eurasia. The Han dynasty itself continued to send out diplomatic missions to the various states of Central Eurasia, and of course there were the trade routes. As the Kushan Empire expanded back into the Tarim Basin, it met once again with the Han, who had by this point defeated the Hunna and then claimed routes across the oasis towns of the desert regions. While the routes would have high and low periods, often depending on the state of various conflicts, in general it seems that Buddhist missionaries probably made it to the Han dynasty and the Yellow River region and founded monasteries as early as the 1st century CE, certainly by the 2nd century. By our best understanding, the folks in these monasteries were already doing a lot of copying and translation of texts, both as a meritorious act and to spread the word. Since this is around the time the Gandharan texts were written, they were likely a part of this larger tradition of copying and translating that was going on across the Silk Road, although many of these early documents did not survive intact into the modern day. One of the earliest records of Buddhism in the Han Dynasty is a record dated to 65 CE. Liu Ying, Prince of Chu and son of Emperor Guangwu of Han, sponsored Buddhism, as well as a school of Taoism, in attempts to better understand longevity and immortality, that same thing that Qin Shi Huangdi was looking for. While he was eventually accused of treason, which put something of a damper on his patronage of the religion, it is the first mention we have in the histories of Buddhism, and in some ways it speaks to something else about, well, the initial acceptance of Buddhism in the Han Dynasty and East Asia in general. While there were likely those well-versed in Buddhism and its philosophy, particularly in the community of foreigners from the Western regions, evidence suggests that for many lay people it was just as likely about what people thought the religion could do for them in this life as anything else. After all, there are many stories of miraculous events, and there was the concept of reincarnation and karma, the idea that by building merit one could improve their lot in the next life. There was even a belief that by building merit one could improve their lot in the current life and apparently extend their life or even possibly gain immortality. Sure, there were the more intellectual and philosophical endeavors, as I said, but for many people, Buddhism was just as much about what it could do for them in the here and now. Stories of monks and other holy men fit right alongside stories of Taoist immortals. In Han tombs, where Buddhist imagery is found, it is often found with or in place of the Queen Mother of the West, the same image, by the way, that's found on many of the bronze mirrors that traveled across to the Japanese archipelago around this time. It was likely that many of the early stories that the laypeople heard were probably fragments as much as anything else. Even with the Tripitaka written down, much of the transmission was still done orally. Furthermore, it was in translation, probably a translation of a translation at that. The earliest stories of Buddhism's transmission, particularly the translation of texts into Sinitic characters, the lingua franca of East Asia, well, they claim that first the Theravada canon and then later Mahayana texts were translated in the 2nd century, with foreigners from Parthia and Kushan credited with these earliest of translations. Others would continue the work, and at first it was mostly people from the western regions doing the translating. One of the earliest stories of sutras making their way to the Han Dynasty comes from the time of Liu Ying, when his brother, Emperor Ming, sat on the throne. The stories claim that the emperor saw an image of a golden Buddha and that he requested either a statue or a temple to be erected. So he sent people off to Kushan, where they found 2 monks whom they would come back with in 68 CE, bringing portraits and scripture, specifically something called the Sutra of 42 Chapters, which the 2 monks helped translate into a Sinitic version at Baima Si, or White Horse Temple. As such, this Sutra of 42 Chapters has been accorded a status as the first such Buddhist work to be brought to the area that is today modern China, and the White Horse Temple, located in Luoyang, is counted as one of the earliest temples in the Yellow River region. That said, there are a lot of questions as to the actual authenticity of this tale, though it does mirror others about the arrival of Buddhism in the East, even if we cannot verify the actual first temple or works translated. Although Buddhism arrived during the Han Dynasty, it wouldn't really begin to fully develop until after the dynasty's fall in the 3rd century. During the Southern and Northern dynasties period, the metaphysical and doctrinal beliefs of Buddhism began to penetrate the elite circles in a more tangible way. Much of the philosophical underpinnings blended well with the interest at the time in dark studies and the school of pure conversation, which we discussed back in episode 72. While Buddhist temples, much like their Taoist brethren, found some sanctuary from the chaos that created this period in the mountains and hills, not to mention a bit of added spiritual cachet, it was really the opportunity to gain greater state patronage that helped them move forward. Monks like Zhi Dun began to reconcile Buddhist thought and doctrine with local beliefs. In some cases, local religious figures, including gods and other spirits, were incorporated into the Buddhist framework, often by their conversion to the Buddha's teachings. This was really one of the strengths of Buddhism. Although it carried with it a framework of Indian religious teachings and thought, it was not exclusive in its cosmological outlook. Buddhism was more focused on helping one escape the suffering of this world, which would take you beyond all such things. As the doctrines were meant for all beings, not just humans, but for animals, spirits, gods, and even demons, there was nothing to necessarily exclude other beliefs. This helped some of the ethnic Han dynasties to accept and even promote Buddhism. Meanwhile, some of the non-ethnic Han dynasties patronized Buddhism for either its miraculous powers or just because it was a foreign religion, much like they were foreigners in the Yellow River Basin. In many cases, state sponsorship was a two-way street. Dynasts would set themselves up as holy men, claiming to be bodhisattvas. They would even appropriate the concept of Chakravartin, a Buddhist golden wheel-turning king, which had overtones of cosmic overlordship. I can see how that would fit in quite well with local concepts that a sovereign might lay claim to ruling all under heaven and be carrying out a heavenly mandate. Along the Yangtze River, Buddhist monks gained a certain amount of independence. They were not expected to bow to the sovereign, for example. This was apparently an acknowledgement of their holy nature. In the Northern Wei dynasty, however, it was a different story. There, the ruler was said to be no less than an incarnation of the Buddha, and a chief monk was selected to oversee the Sangha and no doubt ensure that the various Buddhist communities were in line with official dogma. At the same time, the government provided captured men and women to work fields to help pay for Buddhist temples and their work. Likewise, people would make merit by donating wealth and land to temples in hopes of blessings either in the current life or in the next. For their part, the temples were expected to act as storehouses or granaries. The wealth that poured into them would be used to help alleviate suffering, especially in the case of droughts or floods. It soon became clear, however, that more wealth was going into the temples than was necessarily coming out. There were attempts to rein in this Buddhist establishment, often by limiting the number of temples or even the number of monks, as well as limiting what people could donate. These same edicts were undercut by the elites of the country, however, and often proved less than effectual. Along with sutras and Buddhist teachings, Buddhist images and architecture spread widely. In India and in the Western regions, a key aspect of many temples was the stupa. This was a mound containing a relic of some sort. Originally, these relics were said to be the remnants of the Buddha himself after he had been cremated. Later, it was said that remnants of the Buddha turned hard like crystal and that the original remains were gathered up and distributed to even more stupas. Later, stupas may have contained other relics, such as maybe relics of a particularly holy person. The stupa was an important part of the Buddhist temple, but over time, its character changed. Instead of a mound like we still see in Southeast Asia, we start to see a building, a tower, which became a ubiquitous symbol of Buddhist temples in East Asia. This multi-level pagoda originally started off with simply 3 levels, often made of brick and stone, but over time it grew with 5 or even 7 levels. These towers were inspired by a description in the Lotus Sutra, a Mahayana text that described a bejeweled 7-story tower. Speaking of the Lotus Sutra, this was one of many teachings that made its way to East Asia, and a hugely influential one. It purports to tell the story of a sermon by the Buddha outside of those mentioned in the Theravada texts. The teachings expounded upon in the Lotus Sutra had a great impact on Mahayana Buddhism and how people viewed the teachings of the Buddha. For one, it also proposed the idea that the Buddha did not actually cease to exist when he attained nirvana, but is simply no longer visible. He still remains in the world to help all life find salvation from suffering. That goes along with the concept of the bodhisattva, a being who attains a Buddha-like understanding, but out of compassion remains in the world to assist others. The Lotus Sutra also made claims such as the idea that anyone could attain Buddhahood if they followed the teachings, and not just one particular set of teachings. It opened the idea that there were multiple vehicles, that is to say, different practices, that would all get you to the truth, to enlightenment. Even the term Mahayana refers to the great vehicle, while Mahayana sees Theravada as Hinayana, the lesser vehicle. Both will get you where you need to be, but Mahayana offers an expansion of teachings and texts that Theravada Buddhism does not necessarily accept as authentic. Indeed, in Mahayana belief, we also see a focus on multiple Buddhas with different specialties. Not only the historical Buddha, but, for instance, Vairocana, aka Dainichi Nyorai, the Great Solar Buddha, or Amitabha, aka Amida Nyorai, or Amida Butsu, and so on and so forth. In comparison, the Theravada school tends to be more dogmatic on various points of practice and belief, claiming that they focus on the actual teachings of the historical Buddha and not necessarily looking for other texts outside of that. There may have been Buddhas in previous ages that attained nirvana and departed this existence, but the Buddha of the current age is the historical Buddha, Shakyamuni. Another Buddha, Maitreya, is not expected for another 5 to 10,000 years, not until the teachings of the Buddha have been forgotten and are once again required. Acquiring freedom from this existence through nirvana is not necessarily one and the same with obtaining Buddhahood, the enlightened understanding required to save all beings. There is another school, Vajrayana, the lightning or diamond vehicle. It focuses on tantric or esoteric teachings, which practitioners believe provide a more direct and faster method to enlightenment. Many secret teachings, or Mikyo in Japanese, can trace themselves in some way back to these practices, though it likely didn't make it to East Asia until the Tang Dynasty or so in the 8th century. So we'll come back to it when we get to things like Kukai and Saicho. They were the ones who brought Shingon and Tendai, respectively, to Japan around the early 9th century. That's about 3 centuries from our current chronological position, however, so it'll be a little while. Both the Mahayana and Vajrayana schools included the teachings of the Lotus Sutra, which became one of the most important sutras, certainly by the Tang Dynasty, as well as in the Korean and Japanese archipelago. Its widespread dissemination is often attributed to the famous monk Kumarajiva. Kumarajiva was a citizen of Kucha, one of the oasis kingdoms along the northern edge of the Tarim Basin. It had a bustling metropolis and was one of the larger oasis kingdoms in the Tarim Basin. Even today, you can see remnants of the ancient city in the desert, and dry conditions have preserved a number of artifacts, including plenty of texts referencing Buddhist and other beliefs. Kumarajiva traveled from the peripheral city of Dunhuang, another site renowned for its Buddhist roots, especially the famous caves of Mogao. These are a series of Buddhist grottos built into a cliff face, which, along with the dry conditions, have exquisitely preserved the early sculpture and painting, as well as, again, numerous documents. Now, Kumarajiva came to Chang'an around 401, and he helped translate numerous Buddhist scriptures into Sinitic characters, which could then be shared and read by people across East Asia, everywhere in the ancient Sinic sphere of influence. Besides the Lotus Sutra, another famous text told of the Buddha Amitabha, aka Amida Nyorai or Amida Butsu in Japan. Amitabha's teachings claim that any who would call on the name of Amitabha, or just picture them in their mind with a sincere heart, would on their death find themselves reborn in a Western paradise, a pure land where there were no distractions other than to meditate on the Buddha's teachings and eventually attain freedom from this existence. Whereas many of the teachings and theological discussions of the various Buddhist schools could get quite complex, thus almost requiring any serious student to join a monastery if they wanted to truly study a particular flavor, the teachings of Amitabha were appealing to those without necessarily a lot of time or resources. Boiled down to a few practices that just about anyone could do. It didn't require that you donate huge sums of money or land, although I'm sure the temples wouldn't mind, or that you spend all your day copying scriptures. One could chant the name of Amitabha in the fields as you were working, or picture them in your mind as you prepared for bed. These kinds of practices, the chanting of particular mantras or other such things, became a kind of thing that people could do to help protect themselves or ward off evil. A particular example of this practice is preserved in a text from Dunhuang, which has a colophon explaining its purpose. According to Patricia Abree's translation, the text, which was copied by someone named Sun Sijong, was an incantation that, if said 7, 14, or 21 times a day, with various somatic and material components. For instance, willow twig to cleanse the mouth, scattering flowers and incense before the image of the Buddha, and kneeling and joining the palms of the hands. Well, if you did this, it would clear away the 4 grave sins, the 5 wicked acts, and other transgressions. The current body would not be afflicted by untimely calamities, and one would be reborn into the realm of immeasurably long life. Plus, reincarnation in the female form would be escaped forever. On that last bit, yeah, Buddhism came with a little bit of baggage. In ordering all of life, men were seen as inherently higher on the ladder than women. This discrimination has been walked back or even abolished in many modern interpretations, but it was definitely present in older beliefs. Now, besides the power of the incantation, if said 7, 14, or 21 times a day, Sun Sijong went on to explain that if someone recited it 100 times in the evening and then at noon, then it will ensure rebirth in the western regions, while 200,000 recitations gets you perfect intelligence, and 300,000 recitations, one will see Amitabha Buddha face to face and be reborn in the Pure Land. As you can probably start to see, there were many different beliefs and practices that fell under the Mahayana teachings, and many of the texts were translations. I mean, even those that have been translated into Sinitic, it was often done by foreigners for whom the local Sinic language was not their native tongue, so there was always a kind of awareness that important pieces might have been lost in translation along the way. In the 5th century, this led some monks to make particularly long and dangerous journeys all the way to Kushan and on to India to access the original primary sources for themselves. One such pilgrim was a monk by the name of Fa Xian. At the age of 62, Fa Xian decided to go to India to try to get to the heart of what the Buddha really taught. He set out in 399, traveled across the Tarim Basin, and into the Kashmir region and the Indus Valley, that is, Gandhara in modern Pakistan. From there, he traveled to central India and arrived at Patna, where he stayed and studied for 3 years. He traveled around seeking out works in Sanskrit on Buddhist ethics and teachings, studying the local languages as well. In 410, he made his way to the mouth of the Ganges and down to Sri Lanka, where he stayed for almost 2 years before boarding a ship and traveling home, traveling through the Straits of Malacca and around Southeast Asia to take the sea route back to his home. The journey was perilous, and at least twice the boat lost its way. According to the stories, some of his fellow travelers, who followed more Brahmanic teachings rather than Buddhist, believed that Fashan and his quote-unquote heretical teachings were what were leading them astray. Fashan was able to maintain order and hold people at bay, and he and his books eventually made it safely to the Shandong Peninsula in or around 412. He then made his way down to Jiangkang, aka modern Nanjing on the Yangtze River. There, he spent the rest of his life translating the scriptures he had brought back. Others would make similar journeys, all to try to find more authentic versions of the text, which usually meant finding the Sanskrit version and then creating translations from those. With the growth in popularity in Buddhism, it is probably little wonder that it eventually made its way over to the Korean peninsula. It's hard to say exactly when Buddhism arrived, but the Baekje annals in the Samguk Sagi claim that it was brought there by a monk of Central Asian descent in about 384. 1 year later, we're told the king of Baekje erected a temple and caused 10 men to become monks. The timing of this generally accords with some of the information we find in the Japanese sources in the Nihon Shoki, which claims that Buddhism first came from the western regions to the Han Dynasty, and then to Baekje about 300 years after that. Then to Yamato about 100 years after that. While the dates aren't exact, this generally accords with what we know of the way that Buddhism traveled to East Asia, and to Baekje at least. Although we have textual evidence, there isn't much archaeological evidence for Buddhism on the Korean peninsula in this time outside of urban centers. That's where we find temple roof tiles and other indications that Buddhism was practiced. But at the same time, it was probably something more common amongst elites than the common people, at least in the 4th and early 5th centuries. With the invasions of Goguryeo and the loss of northern territory in about 475, it does appear to have gained some patronage. Still, it wasn't until the 6th century that it really left the urban centers, which is roughly the time we're talking about with the Yamato sovereign Ame Kuniyoshi, aka Kinmei Tenno. So next episode, we'll get into just how Buddhism came over to the islands from the peninsula, or at least what is recorded and what we have evidence for in the 6th century. We'll also talk about its reception and its patronage by the famous, or infamous, Soga clan. Until then, thank you for listening, and thank you again for all of your support. If you like what we're doing, please tell your friends and feel free to rate us wherever you listen to podcasts. If you feel the need to do more and want to help us keep this thing going, we do have information about how you can donate on Patreon or through our coffee site, ko-fi.com/Sengoku Daimyo, or find links over at the main website, sengokudaimyo.com/podcast, where we'll have some more discussion on topics from this episode. Also, feel free to tweet at us at Sengoku Podcast or reach out to our Sengoku Daimyo Facebook page. You can also email us questions, comments at thesengokudaimyo@gmail.com. And that's all for now. Thank you again, and I'll see you next episode on Sengoku Daimyo's Chronicles of Japan.